Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Brian had always been a man of few words, but that never meant he wasn't paying attention. At 38, a civil engineer with a solid career, he'd built a comfortable life alongside Melissa. They'd met in college, married at 25, and for 13 years shared not just a house in the suburbs but also dreams, bank accounts, and the predictable routine of a couple who seemed to have found their place in the world. But in recent months, something had changed. Melissa, 36, an art teacher at a private school, had started repeating a complaint that sounded like an annoying mantra: "You never really listen to me, Brian. You're always in your own world, always distracted." He'd tried arguing back, reminding her of entire conversations they'd had, quoting details she herself had shared, but nothing seemed enough. The accusation persisted, growing like a shadow between them, until Brian began to wonder if there really was something wrong with him. It was an ordinary Tuesday in October when everything changed. Brian had gotten home from work around 7 in the evening, tired after a long day solving problems at a construction site downtown. Melissa was in the bedroom, the door slightly ajar, and he could hear her speaking softly, almost whispering, on the phone. Normally, Brian would have gone straight to the bathroom, taken a shower, and made dinner, as he always did. But something that night made him stop. Maybe it was the intimate tone of her voice, or the soft laugh she let out, a laugh he hadn't heard directed at him in months. Or maybe it was simply the exhaustion of being accused of not paying attention. He wanted to prove, if only to himself, that he did listen, that he cared, that he was present. Brian quietly took off his shoes and left them by the living room entrance, then walked silently down the hallway. The wooden floor creaked slightly under his feet, but Melissa was too absorbed in her conversation to notice. He stopped just a few steps from the bedroom door, leaning against the wall, his heart beating faster than it should have. At first, he couldn't make out her words clearly, just the soft, almost sweet tone she was using. Then she laughed again, and Brian felt something tighten in his chest. I know, Melissa was saying, and there was a lightness in her voice that seemed to have been stolen from their life together. He doesn't suspect a thing. You were here yesterday while he was in the shower, and he didn't notice anything. Brian held his breath. Someone had been in his house. In his living room. While he was where? At work? In the shower? I love you too, Melissa continued, her voice now almost a whisper heavy with emotion. I can't keep pretending anymore. I wish we didn't have to hide. The next words hit him like a series of punches. She spoke about secret meetings, the thrill of taking risks, and how hard it was to stay married to someone who was always distant. Brian closed his eyes for a second, trying to process what he was hearing, but there was nothing to process beyond the raw, painful truth. His wife was having an affair. In their home. Right under his nose. Then she said the name. Greg, you need to be careful when you come over. Last week you almost left your wallet on the couch. Greg. Brian's cousin. The guy who showed up at family barbecues, came to Thanksgiving dinners, and whom Brian considered not just family but a close friend. The guy who had a wife, Lauren, and 2 young kids. The guy who'd been his best man at the wedding. Anger rose in Brian's throat like bile, but he forced himself to stay still, to keep listening. He needed to be sure. He needed to hear it all. Not tomorrow night, Melissa was saying now. Brian will be home. But Friday he has that meeting that always runs late. Can you come around 8? Brian had heard enough. He stepped forward and slowly pushed the bedroom door open. Melissa was lying face down on the bed, the phone pressed to her ear, completely relaxed. When the door creaked, she turned her head reflexively, and seeing Brian standing there, motionless, his face utterly blank, the phone nearly slipped from her hand. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her cheeks. I'll call you back, she quickly said into the phone and hung up, sitting up in bed as if she'd been shocked. Brian, you're home early. He didn't respond. He just stood there, looking at her, letting the silence fill the entire space between them. Melissa swallowed hard, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the sheet. Did you hear everything?" Her voice was trembling. Brian tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost serene, which somehow made everything even more frightening. "I heard. And for once, you're right, Melissa. I should have listened sooner." She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Tears began to form in the corners of her eyes, but Brian had already turned and walked out of the room. He reached into his pocket for his phone, walked to the living room, and without hesitation dialed Greg's number. The phone rang 3 times before his cousin answered. "Hey, cousin. What's up?" Greg's voice was cheerful, guiltless, shameless. Brian took a deep breath. "Greg, I need you to come to my house right now." There was a pause. "Now?" "Man, it's late, now, Greg," Brian repeated, his voice still calm but carrying a weight that left no room for argument. "It's important. Don't make me say it again." Another silence, longer this time. Okay. I'm on my way." Brian hung up and put his phone back in his pocket. Melissa had appeared in the bedroom doorway, pale, her hands shaking. "Brian, I can explain, sit down," he said, pointing to the living room couch. "Now." She obeyed, and he saw tears already streaming down her face, but he felt no pity. Only a strange coldness, as if he were watching everything from outside his own body. Brian picked up his phone again and discreetly opened the video recording app. He placed the phone on top of the bookshelf, angled to capture the entire living room, and pressed the red record button. Melissa was staring at her hands, quietly sobbing, completely unaware. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Brian opened the door to find Greg on the other side, looking confused but trying to smile. "Hey, cousin, what's—" Greg stopped talking the moment he saw Brian's face. Then he saw Melissa sitting on the couch, crying. The color drained from his face too. "Come in," Brian said, and his voice allowed no refusal. Greg stepped inside slowly, glancing from Brian to Melissa and back again. "Sit down," Brian ordered, pointing to the spot next to Melissa on the couch. Greg hesitated but eventually sat, keeping a safe distance from her. Brian stood in front of them, arms crossed, his face a mask of control. "You're going to tell me everything. From start to finish. And don't bother lying, because I already know more than you think." Melissa sobbed louder. Greg ran a hand through his hair, nervous. "Cousin, listen, how long?" Brian cut in. "How long have you two been screwing around in my house, eating at my table, laughing behind my back?" Greg opened and closed his mouth, but it was Melissa who answered, her voice choked. 6 months. 6 months. Half a year." Brian felt the floor sway for a second, but he kept his composure. "And how did it start?" They both stayed silent. Brian took a step forward. "I asked how it started." This time, it was Greg who spoke, his voice low, eyes on the floor. "At the July barbecue. At your place. We talked, had a few beers, and then, she texted me afterward." "He understood me," Melissa suddenly said, as if that justified everything. "He listened to me, Brian. He paid attention to me." Brian let out a short, bitter laugh. "Ah, I see. So the solution was to sleep with my cousin. That makes perfect sense." Greg's hands were shaking. "Cousin, I ruined everything. I know. I'm so sorry, you're sorry?" Brian repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're so sorry that you kept coming over here, eating food I paid for, sleeping with my wife in my bed?" "Not in your bed," Melissa quickly said, as if that made any difference. Brian ignored her, keeping his eyes locked on Greg. "Does Lauren know?" Greg went pale. "No. Please, cousin, don't, please." Brian echoed, and now there was something dangerous in his voice. "You're asking me please? After all this?" Greg started to cry. "I have kids, Brian. Please. I know I ruined everything, I know I don't deserve it, but please, don't tell her." Brian took a deep breath, letting silence settle again. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low but sharp. "Get out of my house. Both of you. Now." Melissa stood up quickly. "Brian, please, we can talk." I said get out," he repeated, louder this time. "Grab your things and leave. Now." Greg was already on his feet, walking quickly toward the door. Melissa hesitated, looking at Brian with red, swollen eyes, but he turned his face away. She grabbed her purse from the couch and followed Greg outside. As soon as the door closed, Brian locked it and leaned against it for a moment, letting the full weight of it all sink in. But not for long. He walked over to the bookshelf, picked up his phone, and stopped the recording. The video was perfect, it showed everything, his questions, their answers, their confessions, their tears, their desperation. Without hesitation, Brian opened WhatsApp, found Lauren's contact, the wife of Greg, and attached the video. He typed a short message, "Lauren, I'm so sorry you have to find out this way. But you deserve to know the truth." He hit send, and seconds later saw the message had been delivered. Lauren viewed it almost immediately. Brian could imagine the scene, her watching the video, disbelief turning into horror, then anger, then pain. 15 minutes later, Brian's phone started ringing non-stop. Messages from the family group chat began flooding in, one after another. Lauren had done exactly what Brian expected, she'd posted the video to the group that included all their relatives. Uncles, aunts, cousins, grandparents, everyone saw it. The messages ranged from shock and anger to support for Brian. Some cursed Greg, others asked how Melissa could have done this. Brian's uncle, Greg's father, sent him a private message, "Brian, I have no words. I'm ashamed. My son will answer for this." Brian didn't reply to anyone. He just turned off his phone and sat on the couch, the same spot where Greg had been sitting minutes earlier. The house was silent. A heavy, suffocating silence, but also strangely freeing. In the weeks that followed, Brian's life turned upside down, but in a way he controlled. Melissa tried to return home the next day but found the locks changed and a letter from Brian's lawyer stating that divorce proceedings had already begun. She called, texted, begged, but Brian blocked all contact. Greg was kicked out of the house by Lauren, who filed for divorce and requested sole custody of their children. The entire family turned their backs on him. He lost his job 2 weeks later when the video spread beyond the family circle and reached his co-workers. His reputation was destroyed overnight. Melissa tried moving back in with her parents, but her mother, who had always favored Brian as a son-in-law, refused to take her in. "You made your choice," her mother told her, according to an aunt who later filled Brian in. "Now live with the consequences." But it was 6 weeks after that night that the final bomb dropped. Brian received a call from Melissa, the first time he'd answered since she'd left. Her voice was shaky, almost inaudible. "Brian, I need to tell you something." He said nothing, just waited. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was absolute. Brian felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. "How far along?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. 2 months. 2 months. Right in the middle of the affair. Brian closed his eyes, mentally running the numbers. They'd slept together a few times during that period, but not often. And Melissa had been with Greg constantly. "I need to know whose it is," she continued, her voice now more desperate. "Brian, please, I need to get a test, but I need your help." "No," he said simply. "What?" "I'm not going to help you with anything, Melissa. If you want to know whose it is, go to Greg. He's the father in every way that matters now." He hung up and blocked her number again. But curiosity, mixed with the need to close that chapter once and for all, consumed him over the following weeks. Brian contacted his lawyer and requested that, as part of the divorce proceedings, a paternity test be conducted as soon as the baby was born. Melissa, with few options, agreed. The months dragged on. Brian threw himself into work, accepting a major project that kept him busy and distant. He cut ties with most relatives, including those close to Greg, and slowly rebuilt his life. He sold the house he'd shared with Melissa and bought a modern apartment downtown, a place with no memories, no ghosts. In April, 7 months after that awful night, Melissa gave birth to a boy. The paternity test was done 2 weeks later. Brian received the results by email on a Tuesday morning while having coffee in his new apartment. He opened the PDF with steady hands, his eyes scanning the technical lines until he found the conclusion: probability of paternity, 0%. Brian Lawson is excluded as the biological father. He read it again. And again. Then he closed his laptop and looked out the window at the city waking below. There was no relief. No pain. Just confirmation of what he'd already known deep down: it had all ended long before that October night. He'd simply finally had the courage to listen. Brian's lawyer sent the results to the judge, and the divorce was finalized in record time. Brian didn't ask for alimony or fight over disputed assets. He wanted only one thing: for it all to be over. And it was. Melissa tried reaching out to Greg after the test results came back, but he blocked her too. Lauren had already moved on and obtained a restraining order against her ex-husband, who now lived in a tiny apartment across town, working temporary jobs and avoiding anywhere he might run into family. Melissa raised her son alone, working part-time and relying on hesitant help from her parents. The few friends she had left drifted away after the story spread. She sent Brian a letter 6 months after the divorce was finalized, a long letter begging for forgiveness, trying to explain, trying somehow to fix what couldn't be fixed. Brian never opened it. He threw it in the trash without reading a single word. A year and a half after that night, Brian was sitting at a downtown cafe, reviewing blueprints for a new project, when he saw Melissa walk in with a stroller. She was thinner, her face tired, her eyes dull. She saw him too, and for a second their eyes met. Brian saw her desire to approach, to speak, maybe to try once more to explain herself. But he simply returned his attention to the blueprints on the table, as if she were just another stranger. Melissa stood there for a few seconds, holding the stroller, then walked on, disappearing into the street crowd. Brian finished his coffee, paid the bill, and left. He had an important meeting in an hour, dinner with new friends that night, and a weekend trip to the coast already planned. His life had moved on. He'd learned, in the most painful way possible, that sometimes truly listening means hearing not just the words people say, but also the ones they hide. And even more importantly, he'd learned that not every truth needs to be forgiven. Some truths simply mark an ending. And that was okay. Because for the first time in a long while, Brian wasn't listening to anyone's criticism, wasn't carrying the weight of expectations from a woman who'd never valued him. He was finally listening to himself. And what he heard was clarity. Peace. Freedom. Months turned into over 2 years since that night. Brian, now 40, had become a completely renewed version of himself. The pain that once occupied every corner of his thoughts had been replaced by a healthy routine, genuine friends, and clear purpose. He'd been promoted to project manager at his company, leading a team of 12, and was respected not just for his technical skill but for the fair and attentive way he treated his colleagues. Ironically, everyone remarked on what a great listener he was. In his personal life, Brian had met Sophie, a 35-year-old landscape architect who collaborated with his company on joint projects. She was different from Melissa in every way: independent, communicative, honest. There were no games, no hidden agendas. When she had something to say, she said it directly. When he had something to say, she listened. Really listened. They'd been together for 8 months, taking things slowly but with a solidity Brian had never experienced before. Meanwhile, Melissa's life continued its downward spiral. The boy, whom she'd named Ethan, was now almost 2, but Greg never actively claimed paternity. He paid the minimal court-ordered child support but didn't visit his son and cut off all emotional contact. Lauren, now divorced and rebuilding her life with her 2 kids, had moved to another city, far from painful memories. Melissa lived in a small rented apartment, struggling to balance part-time work with child care. Her parents helped financially, but their relationship was strained. She had practically no friends, and the social media accounts that once overflowed with photos of her seemingly perfect life with Brian were now abandoned. Her reputation in their community was ruined. Even people who didn't know all the details knew enough to avoid her. As for Greg, he was in even worse shape. After losing his job and family, he'd tried to start over in another city, but the story followed him. Some relative always knew someone, some former coworker always told new ones. He ended up taking manual labor jobs, far from the career he'd built, and lived alone in a tiny studio, drowning his nights in regret and alcohol. Brian learned all this not because he sought it out, but because the part of his family that stayed loyal to him occasionally mentioned it. He listened, thanked them for their concern, but felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no pity. Just indifference. It was as if Melissa and Greg were characters in a story he'd read long ago, whose plot no longer mattered to him. One Saturday afternoon, Brian was at the grocery store when he saw Greg on the other side of the aisle. His cousin was pushing a cart with just a few basic items, his posture slumped, his eyes tired. He hadn't seen Brian yet. For a moment, Brian considered simply walking away, avoiding any interaction. But then Greg turned his head, and their eyes met. The recognition was instant, followed by what looked like terror on Greg's face. He froze, the cart motionless in the middle of the aisle. Brian didn't look away. He just stared back, neutral, expressionless. Greg opened his mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out. Then he lowered his head, quickly pushed the cart in the opposite direction, and disappeared into another section of the store. Brian continued his shopping as if nothing had happened. Because, in the end, nothing had. That night, Brian had dinner with Sophie at his apartment. They cooked together, laughed at inside jokes, and then sat on the couch watching a documentary she'd recommended. At no point did Brian mention running into Greg. There was no need. That no longer belonged to his life. Before bed, Brian looked out the bedroom window, watching the city lights blink in the distance. He briefly thought about how much his life had changed since that October night 2.5 years ago. He thought about how a single decision, to stand still in the hallway and truly listen, had set everything in motion. There was no regret. No wish to go back. Because if he hadn't listened that night, he'd have gone on living a lie. He'd have kept being accused of not paying attention while his life was quietly destroyed all around him. He'd finally listened. And by listening, he'd freed himself. Brian knew Melissa probably still thought about him, still carried the weight of guilt and regret. He knew Greg lived haunted by what he'd done, by what he'd lost. But those were their stories to carry, not his. He'd learned the most valuable lesson of all: the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth more than a comfortable lie. And sometimes, the only way to really hear someone is to listen not just to what they say, but also to what they try to hide. That night, with Sophie sleeping beside him, her breathing soft and steady, Brian finally felt something he hadn't felt in years: gratitude. Gratitude for having had the strength to listen. Gratitude for having had the courage to act. And gratitude for having found, after everything, not just justice, but peace. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.